In the winter of 1314, a single lie was enough to kill a man, uproot a family, and set an entire village on fire, socially, politically, and nearly literally. But here's the part that still shocks historians today. In a world without police, without modern courts, and without any forensic tools, more than 1 in 3 medieval accusations turned out to be false, yet they were still enough to end a life. And that leads to the question that frames everything you're about to hear. How does a small, isolated medieval community decide guilt or innocence when fear becomes stronger than truth? This is the story of the stolen ox of St. Brian, a quiet valley village that existed far from royal cities and far from the protection of lords. A place where survival lived on the edge of hunger, and where reputation was more valuable than coin. In places like this, an accusation was not simply a claim, it was a weapon, a spark tossed into a house made entirely of dry straw. And the moment the spark landed, nothing could stop the fire. The trouble began before sunrise, on a morning when frost coated the thatched rooftops like powdered bone. Villagers woke to the sound of a horn, short, panicked, and breaking the usual silence of dawn. Within minutes, doors cracked open, boots hit frozen ground, and people rushed toward the pasture that bordered the forest. At the center of the small crowd stood Renaud, a wealthy but unpopular livestock owner, his breath fogging the air as he pointed fiercely toward an empty rope and a disturbed patch of frozen mud. His prized ox, worth nearly a family's entire yearly income, had vanished. Oxen weren't simply animals in this era. They were productivity, survival, winter plowing, transport, trade. Losing one was like losing your savings, business, and future all at once. So Renaud wasted no time. Before anyone could question, investigate, or even calm him, he shouted the words that would nearly destroy the village. It was stolen. Someone here took it. Statistics from medieval records tell us that when a theft was announced in a village of fewer than 50 households, the accused was almost always someone of lower status, someone with fewer friends, someone who didn't belong completely. Renaud knew that. And within moments, he had already fixed his suspicion on a man he had argued with many times before. Thomas the tanner, poor, quiet, and living on the outskirts of St. Brian with his wife and 2 children. Thomas wasn't present that morning. He rarely appeared during communal gatherings unless required. His absence, in the heated minds of frightened villagers, looked like guilt. It would take only 30 minutes for rumors to form, and only 2 hours for those rumors to harden into certainty. By late morning, every person in St. Brian had heard a version of the same idea. Thomas must have taken the ox. Who else would risk so much? Who else needed the money so desperately? Who else had once argued with Renaud about grazing rights and boundary lines? Fear works fast in a society that depends on fragile stability. In those first chaotic hours, the villagers weren't trying to destroy a family. They were trying to protect themselves from the possibility that a thief lived among them. What if their animals were next? Their tools? Their grain? Better to accuse one man than to face uncertainty. But the truth is more complicated. Medieval villages carried invisible scars, old grudges, hidden debts, family feuds, alliances, whispered resentments. And the moment a person became the focus of suspicion, all of those buried feelings rose like smoke from a fire that had never truly gone out. Around midday, the village gathered in the central clearing. No laws required this. It was simply how these communities functioned. Without a sheriff, judge, or constable, the people governed themselves with what was called communal justice. The idea was simple. If enough villagers believed something, it became truth. If enough villagers declared an accusation credible, it became law. That afternoon, they marched as a group toward Thomas's small cottage, 5 minutes beyond the last row of homes, at the edge of the frostbitten woods. The cottage was humble, patched wood, smoke trickling faintly from a crooked chimney, a shed beside it where he tanned hides. As the villagers approached, his wife, Mariette, stepped out with visible worry. Renaud pushed past her without hesitation. "Where is the ox?" he demanded. Mariette was stunned. "What ox?" "The one your husband stole." She said nothing at first. Not out of guilt, but fear. She understood that the situation was spiraling out of control. She understood something else, too. When a crowd came with a conclusion already formed, explanations rarely mattered. Tomas emerged moments later, wiping his hands on a cloth stained with hide tanning residue. He froze when he saw the crowd, sensing instantly that this was no ordinary gathering. Renat stepped toward him, jabbing a finger in his face. "You took it. Confess now and spare us the trouble." Tomas looked genuinely confused. "I took nothing from you." And that denial was the moment everything cracked. Medieval justice did not depend on forensic evidence, tracks in the snow, or logical reasoning. It depended on oaths, reputation, witnesses, and alliances. If the majority doubted your oath, you lost, no matter how innocent you were. Someone from the crowd shouted, "Then why were you not at the pasture this morning?" Another chimed in, "You hate Renat, you said so yourself." A third added, "Your children are hungry. Everyone knows it." None of these were proofs, but they were believable enough to create momentum. Renat seized the moment, lifting his arms high like a preacher delivering a sermon. He has the skill to butcher an ox. He has the tools. He has the motive. Are we blind? Voices rose in agreement. In less than 3 minutes, a village that had known Tomas for 12 years began turning against him. But there were still a few who hesitated: old Mirelle, the herb woman, who had once been helped by Tomas during a harsh winter, Pierre, the miller, who believed in slower judgment, and Hugo, a young woodcutter who simply disliked Renat's arrogance. Still, 3 voices weren't enough to counter 20 furious ones. In medieval communities, silence was often taken as agreement, and fear kept many silent. Renat declared what they should do next. Since there was no sheriff, no written law, and no official authority, the village had to rely on a practice older than the kingdom itself, compurgation, also known as oath-helping. The accused must bring forward a group of oath-helpers, usually 12 trusted villagers, who would swear collectively that the accused was honest. If the accused failed to gather enough people willing to swear for him, he was judged guilty. Not because of evidence, but because of social isolation.
Tomas looked around at the crowd. These were the people he worked beside, traded with, lived among. But many avoided his gaze. Some looked away out of fear of Renat. Others looked away because siding with an accused man was dangerous. The difficulty of finding oath helpers would soon reveal something much darker beneath the surface of St. Brian. Pierre tried to intervene. "Let us search the forest first," he urged. "Wolves roam these parts. The ox may have fled, or been taken by poachers from outside the village." But Renat shot back, "And waste daylight? We know who did this." The crowd murmured in agreement. The more voices agreeing, the stronger the illusion of certainty became. Tomas was given until sunset to gather his 12 oath helpers. He needed 12 people willing to stake their own honor on his innocence. 12 people who risked punishment themselves if he was later found guilty. 12 people who trusted him more than they feared Renat. By late afternoon, Tomas had found 3. Mariette begged neighbors. She knocked on doors. She pleaded for fairness. But people closed their homes, whispered excuses, avoided involvement. Some were genuinely unsure. Some were afraid of Renat. Wealthy villagers held unusual power, even without legal authority. Others believed that a tanner, often treated as unclean, was simply the most likely culprit. Sociologists analyzing medieval communities have confirmed a haunting truth. When fear and tension rise, people look for a scapegoat, and the scapegoat is almost always someone already at the margins. As shadows lengthened and the sun dipped behind the tree line, Tomas returned to the village square with only 3 oath helpers at his side. The entire population of St. Brian gathered there, their faces illuminated by lanterns and torches. Renat stepped forward triumphantly. 3? Is this a joke? You cannot even gather half the number. Tomas said nothing. His silence spoke louder than any argument he could have made. In the eyes of communal justice, failing to produce oath helpers was practically the same as confessing. The villagers now believed the ox was gone forever, eaten, sold, butchered, hidden. And since oxen were too valuable to lose without repercussion, punishment needed to be severe enough to deter future theft. Some argued Tomas should be forced to pay the full value of the ox, an impossible sum for a poor tanner. Others argued he should be banished. A few hot-headed voices even suggested trial by ordeal, forcing Tomas to plunge his hand into boiling water to test innocence. But ordeal had been discouraged by the church for years, and no priest lived in the village to oversee it. As the debate grew heated, Pierre raised his voice again. At least let him speak. Let him explain where he was at dawn. Tomas stepped forward, trembling. Not from fear of punishment, but from the realization that truth had no place here. He spoke softly. I was in my workshop, alone, preparing hides before the frost ruined them. Mariette and the children were asleep. Convenient, Renat snapped. No witnesses. Then someone from the back shouted, search his workshop. And that was the moment when everything escalated beyond return. The villagers surged toward the shed. Tomas tried to stop them, but he was shoved aside. People tore open crates, overturned barrels, scattered tools, kicked open the back storage room. And within minutes, someone shouted the words that froze Tomas's blood. Here, a rope, freshly cut. Renat stormed inside and held up the rope fragment triumphantly. This proves it. This is the ox's tether. But it wasn't. Tanners used ropes constantly, soaking hides, stretching them, binding them. A rope in Tomas's shed meant nothing. Yet in the fevered atmosphere of accusation, it became the missing puzzle piece people wanted to see. More villagers shouted in agreement, convinced the evidence was overwhelming. Pierre tried to object, pointing out that dozens of homes had rope inside. But his voice was drowned by the crowd. With each passing moment, the villagers became more certain, even though their certainty was built on fear, assumption, and the persuasive confidence of a man who had already decided the ending of the story. By nightfall, Tomas was declared guilty, not by proof, but by lack of support. The verdict was unanimous except for 3 dissenters. And his punishment was set for the following morning. The value of the ox was more than Tomas had earned in a decade. And without the ability to pay, he faced the grim alternative, physical punishment or exile. For Mariette, the night was endless. She sat beside him in the dim candlelight, their children sleeping fitfully nearby, unaware that their lives were about to collapse. She whispered that everything would be all right, though she no longer believed it. Outside, the village slept uneasily. Not because of guilt, but because once people commit to punishing someone, reversing course becomes psychologically impossible. To admit doubt would mean admitting injustice. But St. Brian was not done with surprises. At dawn, moments before Tomas was to face the punishment that would mark him for life, everything changed. Far beyond the pasture, deep in the frozen woods where few dared to wander, a hunter named Albin discovered something that made his heart stop. Tracks. Large tracks. Ox tracks. Fresh ones. And beside them, wolf prints. What happened next would shake the village from its foundations. Albin froze over the snow-covered ground, staring at the cluster of tracks like a man who had just stumbled upon a secret the world wasn't meant to reveal. The ox prints were unmistakable, broad, deep, and recently made. The snow around them had not yet hardened, meaning the animal had passed through only hours ago. But what disturbed Albin more were the other prints surrounding them. Elongated, narrow, and sharp with claw indentations. Wolf prints. Multiple wolves. St. Brian hadn't seen a wolf pack this close to the village in years. The surrounding woods had been silent of their cries for so long that people had almost forgotten the threat they once posed. But the evidence was right here, frozen into the snow, telling a story far more frightening than theft. An ox, wandering alone in the middle of the night, stalked by wolves. Albin followed the tracks for nearly half a mile, deeper into the forest. Branches brushed his shoulders and scraped against his thick coat. Frost clung to his beard. But he kept going until he reached a clearing where the early sunlight barely touched the white ground. Then he saw it. The carcass lay on its side, half buried under broken branches and trampled snow. The ox's ribs were torn open, its hide scattered in strips across the ground. Steam still rose faintly from the remains, mixing with the cold morning air. The wolves had fed and moved on. Albin dropped to his knees. This was Renat's ox, recognizable even in death. A distinctive notch on its left horn confirmed it. The ox had not been stolen. It had fled, wandered, or been chased from its pasture and become prey. Albin stood in the silence, feeling the weight of the realization pressing against him. If he brought this news back to the village, everything that had happened the previous day, the accusations, the anger, the judgment, would unravel. And the villagers, especially Renat, would not accept that easily. Yet the truth was there at his feet, undeniable. Albin took a deep breath, memorized the scene, and turned back toward the village. The sun was just beginning to rise as he emerged from the treeline. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Doors were opening. People were gathering in the square for Tomas's punishment. Voices murmured with expectation and grim satisfaction. Tomas stood in the center, hands bound loosely at the front, his face pale but expression calm. Mariette clutched their children to her. Renat stood tall, arms crossed, watching everything unfold as if presiding over a court he himself had created. Just as the appointed elder stepped forward to deliver the formal sentence, a shout echoed from the edge of the gathering. "Stop!" Heads turned. People murmured. And then the crowd parted as Albin strode forward, breathless, snow still clinging to his boots and cloak. Renat frowned. "What is the meaning of this?" Albin didn't waste a second. "I found your ox," he said loudly, "in the eastern woods." A wave of reaction rippled through the crowd. Some gasped. Others whispered. Tomas lifted his head in disbelief. Renat narrowed his eyes. "Where? And alive or dead?" "Dead," Albin replied. "Killed by wolves. Fresh tracks. Fresh kill. It happened during the night." Renat scoffed as if refusing the idea outright. "Nonsense. Wolves haven't come near the village in years. My ox was tied securely. Someone untied it." Albin stepped closer. The rope was snapped, torn, not cut. "You'll see it yourself. There are claw marks on the ground. You can smell the blood. This wasn't theft. It was predation." The silence grew dense. Uncomfortable. Cracks began forming in the certainty the villagers had felt the night before. Young Hugo, the woodcutter, spoke up. "Did you see the animal? Are you certain it was Renat's?" "The notch on the left horn," Albin said immediately. "Exactly as described." This time the crowd reacted more strongly. Several people exchanged uneasy looks. Pierre visibly exhaled, relief washing over him. Morel nodded slowly, murmuring a quiet prayer. Renat, however, clenched his jaw. "You're mistaken," he insisted coldly. "What you found was not my ox. My ox was stolen." "It wasn't," Albin replied firmly. "I followed the tracks myself. They lead directly from your pasture." Renat snapped back. "Then show me." Albin gestured toward the forest. "Come with me. All of you. See it with your own eyes." The villagers hesitated. They didn't want to admit they might have wrongfully condemned a man. But the possibility was now real. And once the seed of doubt was planted, it grew quickly. Finally, Pierre spoke. "We owe it to Tomas to verify. If an innocent man is punished today, we all bear the guilt." That was enough. People began murmuring in agreement. And within a minute, the entire crowd, cold, tense, and unsure, started toward the forest behind Albin. Tomas walked last, unbound now, though too stunned to speak. The path into the woods was narrow, lined with frost-covered pines and barren branches. As the villagers walked deeper, Renat's confidence began to waver. Every footprint Albin pointed out, every broken twig, every disturbed patch of snow, told a consistent story. By the time they reached the clearing, no one could deny the truth. The ox carcass lay where Albin had found it, the ground stained dark, the ribs exposed like pale fingers. Wolf tracks circled the scene. The silence that followed was unlike the day before. It was no longer angry, no longer heated. It was hollow, heavy, filled with shame. Renat was the last to step forward. He stared at the remains for several long seconds, his breath unsteady. Then he muttered, barely audible, This cannot be." But it was. Pierre turned toward him. "You accused a man with no proof. You nearly condemned him." Renat's face tightened. How was I to know? The ox was gone. The rope was broken. Someone had to be responsible. Hugo crossed his arms. And you chose Tomas. Because it was easy. Morel's voice was soft but sharp. You let anger decide truth. Renaud didn't respond. His eyes darted toward Tomas, who stood at the back of the group, his wife clinging to his arm, the children trembling beside them. The elder of the village cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the still air. We made a mistake, he said solemnly. A grave one. Several villagers nodded, ashamed. Others avoided Tomas's eyes entirely. In medieval communities, justice wasn't just about rules. It was about relationships, trust, and long-term consequences. The village had nearly destroyed one of its own based on fear and convenience. And now, standing in front of the ox's carcass, they realized the cost of their haste. The walk back to St. Brian was silent. Once in the square again, the elder addressed the village formally. Tomas is innocent. We wronged him, and we owe him reparations. Renaud stiffened. Reparations? From whom? From the village, the elder replied. We all played a part. The murmurs rose. People shifted uncomfortably. Paying compensation meant giving grain, goods, or coin, precious things in a community barely surviving winter. But it was necessary. Tomas stepped forward slowly, his voice quiet but steady. I do not want your coin, he said. I want only two things, the clearing of my name and the safety of my family. The villagers lowered their heads. Mariette added, and no more fear. Let no other family suffer this. Pierre nodded firmly. We must change how we judge one another. This cannot happen again. That statement would be remembered for years, because it became the turning point that reshaped the entire culture of the village. St. Brian began implementing new rules, informal, unwritten, but followed by all. Accusations could no longer be made without witnesses. Searches required at least 3 neutral villagers. Oath helpers needed to be chosen voluntarily, without pressure. Most importantly, fear could no longer outrun truth. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between Tomas and the village shifted. Some villagers avoided him out of guilt. Others offered quiet gestures, extra bread, help repairing his shed, small gifts for his children. But the real transformation came from something unexpected. Renaud, who had been arrogant, wealthy, and accustomed to getting his way, became unusually quiet. Days passed without him visiting the square. He worked alone in his pasture, keeping to himself. And then, one morning, he visited Tomas's home. No crowd. No witnesses. Just the two of them. Renaud stood outside the tanner's door, hat in hand, snow falling lightly around him. Tomas opened the door cautiously. Renaud swallowed hard and spoke in a low voice. I was wrong, he said. I acted out of anger. Out of fear. And I let those things blind me. Tomas didn't respond at first. He simply watched the man who had nearly ruined his life struggle to form an apology. Renaud continued. If you need grain this winter, or help repairing your shed, or anything at all, you have only to ask. Tomas finally spoke. I want nothing from you, Renaud. Accept this. The next time fear comes for you, do not let it take the whole village with you. Renaud lowered his head. I hear you. The apology didn't erase what had happened. But it marked the beginning of something rare in medieval communities. Reflection. The village learned more in those few weeks than they had in decades. They learned that the absence of formal law did not mean the absence of responsibility. They learned that fear spreads faster than truth. They learned that one accusation, just one, could nearly destroy everything they had built. Over time, the story of the stolen ox became a cautionary tale. Parents told it to their children. Traders told it in neighboring villages. It became a quiet reminder whispered during disputes. Remember St. Brian. Remember the ox. Because what happened there was not unique. Historians estimate that in the Middle Ages, wrongful accusations were common enough to place entire communities at risk. But St. Brian was one of the few villages recorded in oral memory to acknowledge its mistake. And more importantly, to change because of it. As spring approached, wolves disappeared back into the deeper forests. The village slowly returned to normal. The fields thawed. The stream flowed freely again. Life continued, hard, fragile, and precious. But one truth remained. A single accusation, spoken without caution, had almost destroyed them. And it would serve as a reminder for generations that justice requires more than anger. It requires patience, courage, and the willingness to face uncertainty before drawing conclusions. In the wake of the ox's discovery, something subtle yet powerful began to shift inside St. Brian. When a community has nearly torn itself apart, it learns to hold its breath around its own shadows. And for the first time in living memory, the villagers started questioning the certainty with which they once judged each other. By early spring, the snow receded into muddy patches. The meadows shifted from white to brown, then finally to soft green. Life returned, the kind of life that moves quietly without needing permission. Thawing soil, new shoots, calves being born, the steady rhythms of labor that define a medieval year. But beneath that surface revival, trust, once taken for granted, had been shaken. And the village now had to rebuild what fear had nearly destroyed. The people of St. Brian didn't hold formal meetings often. They didn't write laws or draft charters. Their entire system of governance was built on unwritten expectations, shared values, and inherited traditions older than the kingdom itself. But after the ox incident, these invisible rules felt more fragile than ever. One evening, shortly after dusk, the villagers gathered around the large communal fire near the center of the square. Not for punishment, not for judgment, but simply to speak. It was one of the rare times they felt the need for collective reflection, an early form of civic discussion long before such words existed. Children chased each other along the edges, their laughter mixing with the crackle of burning wood. Adults stood in clusters, some speaking quietly, others listening. Tomas was there too, sitting beside his wife, both of them watching the flames with a mixture of relief and guarded distance. The village elder stepped forward and raised a hand, signaling for silence. "We nearly lost our unity," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering. "And a village without unity is already halfway to ruin." People nodded, not because he told them to, but because they felt the truth of it vibrating beneath their feet. He continued, "We cannot undo what was done, but we can decide how we move forward. So I ask you, what must change?" The first person to speak was Mirel, the herb woman. "Fear is quick," she said, "quicker than reason, and we let quickness rule the day. In the future, we should wait, even one night. Accusations should not be acted upon until the sun has risen twice." The elder nodded thoughtfully. 2 days before judgment. Time for tempers to cool. Time for truth to surface. Another voice joined in, Hugo, the woodcutter. "We must search before we accuse," he said. "The forest is full of dangers. Animals vanish. Tools vanish. Even people vanish. We should always search together before claiming theft." Pierre, always steady, added, "And the accused must speak without being shouted down." A murmur of agreement spread. Then someone suggested witnesses. Someone else suggested that personal grudges should be declared openly before accusations were accepted. Another argued that oath-helping should no longer be the only path to innocence. They were building a new idea, piece by piece, without realizing it. A primitive justice system, shaped not by scholars or kings, but by ordinary villagers learning from their own mistakes. Tomas listened to every word, silent, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He didn't need to speak. The entire discussion was happening because of him. As the meeting continued, the tone shifted from caution to hope. People began speaking not just about justice, but about safety, about wolves, about the changing weather, about the need to reinforce the livestock enclosures now that predators had returned. For the first time in months, villagers spoke to Tomas as if he belonged again. And when the fire burned low, it was Renaud who stepped forward. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the circle, hands trembling slightly. His pride had been wounded, perhaps the only wound he truly felt. But this moment demanded something from him he had never before offered publicly. His voice cracked as he began. "I have something to say." Conversations turned to silence. All eyes fell on him. Renaud took a deep breath. I let anger blind me. I let fear lead me. And I let my suspicion turn into certainty without reason. I wronged Tomas. And I wronged all of you. The words were not graceful, but they were honest. Or at least, honest enough. And that mattered more in a small medieval community than perfect humility. He continued, I will help repair the pasture fence. And from this day on, no accusation will come from my mouth without proof. Tomas finally looked up, meeting Renaud's eyes for the first time since the ordeal. The elder nodded slowly. Let this be the lesson we carry from winter into spring. The fire crackled, sparks rising into the night sky. And in that moment, the village, broken only weeks before, felt something tighten between them again. A thread of shared responsibility. A fragile but renewed trust. But the aftermath of the ox incident wasn't finished shaping St. Brian. Not yet. As spring deepened, the wolves returned more frequently to the edge of the forest. Farmers spotted them slipping through the trees at dusk, their silhouettes moving like ghosts. 2 sheep were taken from the western pasture. A goat vanished from a nearby homestead. Livestock became restless, sensing predators long before humans did. It soon became clear that the village couldn't simply rely on trust and new rules. They needed protection. And since there was no sheriff, no constable, and no royal patrols anywhere near their isolated valley, they had to protect themselves. This led to an idea that would change their way of life for the next decade. A night watch. It began with 3 volunteers, Hugo, Pierre, and a young shepherd named Colin. They agreed to rotate patrols around the village after dusk, carrying torches and simple weapons, clubs, hooks, and occasionally a bow borrowed from the hunters. They weren't soldiers, but they were vigilant. Their presence alone reduced the boldness of wolves. Before long, other men joined. Even Renaud took a few shifts, though mostly out of guilt and the desire to restore his public image. They built a small watch hut near the main path into the village, where a fire could be kept burning through the night. This watch wasn't merely about wolves. It became symbolic, a sign that the village would no longer rely solely on reaction but on prevention. One night, as Hugo and Pierre stood their shift under a cloudy moon, Pierre spoke the words that would later be repeated by future generations in St. Brian. We failed Tomas because we watched nothing. Not the forest. Not each other. Not our own fear. Hugo nodded. Now we watch. And we protect. That is how we keep our village alive. The watch also had an unexpected effect on social cohesion. Men who had rarely spoken began sharing stories during the lonely hours of the night. Old grudges faded. New alliances grew. People learned more about each other in those quiet shifts than they had during any harvest festival. Tomas never served on the watch. His work with hides took all his daylight hours, and his nights were spent with his family, but he often brought warm water or bread to the watch hut, small gestures of gratitude. Meanwhile, Renaud struggled privately. He was a man used to status, used to being right, used to being respected, used to being feared. But after the ox affair, people treated him differently. Not with hostility, but with distance. He felt the weight of their doubt every time he entered the square. In medieval villages, reputation was currency. And Renaud had lost much of his. He tried to repair it through good deeds, helping neighbors, giving extra grain to a struggling widow, offering tools to anyone who needed them. But he soon realized something painful. It wasn't that the villagers disliked him now. It was that they no longer trusted him to lead. And that shift transformed the balance of power in St. Brian. Pierre emerged as the quiet center of the village's new moral gravity. People sought his opinion. They asked for his advice during disputes. Even the elder began relying on him during particularly tense disagreements. Tomas, too, became a symbol, though not of leadership. Instead, he represented caution, humility, and the reminder of what could happen when a community lets fear replace truth. But the next major turning point came during summer. A trader arrived from a distant town, passing through St. Brian with a wagon full of wool, iron nails, and salt. He spent a night in the village, ate with the locals, and listened as children repeated the story of the stolen ox, as children always do, unaware of the weight their words carry. The trader's face darkened as he listened. I have heard a story like this before, he said finally. 2 winters ago, in a village beyond the hills, a man was accused of stealing a cow. They punished him harshly. Weeks later, the animal's remains were found in the forest, killed by hungry beasts. The village never recovered from the shame. Some families left. Others turned against each other. Within a year, the place fell into ruin. A shiver rippled through the crowd. The parallels were too close. The trader continued, "You people were fortunate. Most villages never discover the truth." That night, as the traders slept in the guest barn, the villagers discussed his words in hushed voices. Fortunate. The word repeated itself like an echo inside every mind. But saved by chance. If Albin hadn't gone hunting early. If wolves had dragged the carcass deeper into the woods. If snow had fallen over the tracks. If Renat had insisted on immediate punishment. Just a few different choices, and St. Brian's story would have been one of tragedy, not recovery. This realization ignited something deeper inside the villagers, an understanding that their new rules were not just a reaction to a mistake, but a necessary evolution of their community. They began writing their accountability not on parchment but in the way they lived. Children were taught that accusations required proof. Neighbors learned to confront conflicts before letting resentment fester. People with grudges were encouraged to declare them openly rather than hiding behind suspicion. And every major decision required communal agreement, not the loudest voice. But history is never a straight path. And the autumn that followed brought a new challenge, one that would test whether St. Brian had truly learned from its past. A young man named Aloy, barely 18, arrived in the village seeking seasonal work. His clothes were worn, his boots cracked, but he carried himself with quiet determination. He was polite, skilled with tools, and eager to help. But he was also an outsider. And in medieval villages, outsiders lived under a permanent cloud of curiosity and suspicion. At first, no one had any reason to mistrust him. He repaired fences, helped with harvesting, and slept in the barn behind the mill. Children liked him. Elders appreciated his work ethic. But then food began disappearing. First a loaf of bread, then a chicken, then a sack of barley. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to stir murmurs of concern. And the pattern was painfully familiar. Whispers began behind closed doors. Eyes narrowed as Aloy walked through the square. Mothers pulled children closer. A sense of unease built slowly, like fog creeping along the ground. Pierre noticed it first. Morel noticed it second. Tomas noticed it last, but with the sharpest fear, because he recognized the early signs of the storm that had nearly destroyed him. One evening, as villagers gathered to debate the missing food, Renat spoke louder than he needed to. "We have a stranger here," he said, glancing toward Aloy, who stood aside quietly. A stranger who arrived just before the thefts. The crowd murmured. Aloy lowered his head. For a moment, the village teetered on the edge of repeating its past. The air felt tense, brittle, ready to snap. But this time, something was different. Pierre stepped forward immediately. "Before anyone speaks another word," he said firmly, "we search." Murmurs stopped. Morel added, "And we wait. No judgment tonight." Tomas finally stepped closer, his voice steady but unmistakably emotional. "And we speak to him before speaking about him." The village froze. Because Tomas, the man who had once stood alone against an accusing crowd, was now stepping forward to protect someone else from that very fate. And in that moment, St. Brian proved something remarkable. It had not only learned from its mistake, it had changed because of it. Pierre's words hung in the air like a protective shield. The moment he spoke them, the older villagers exchanged glances, some relieved, some surprised, and a few irritated that their suspicion had been interrupted before it could grow. Aloy stood alone at the edge of the gathering, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the ground. He looked exactly the way Tomas had looked the day Renat accused him, isolated, outnumbered, and already halfway judged. But this time, something in the village held steady, something they had earned painfully through the winter's ordeal. The elder cleared his throat. "We will not accuse until we understand." Renat, who had not spoken again since the winter, clenched his jaw but said nothing. He had learned, perhaps more than anyone, what came from speaking too quickly. Pierre approached Aloy and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Tell us where you were these past nights, lad." Aloy swallowed. "I was in the barn behind the mill. I leave only at dawn." "Alone?" Pierre asked. "Yes." Pierre nodded, neither satisfied nor doubtful. He simply took the information and folded it into the larger truth still waiting to be uncovered. The elder lifted a lantern. "Then we searched the barns, the storage sheds, the mill, the fields. And we searched the forest edge too. Food doesn't vanish into thin air." So the villagers split into small groups, carrying lanterns that cast shaky circles of light across the ground. Dogs were brought along to sniff out tracks. Children were kept indoors. Even Renat joined the search, though mostly to avoid the appearance of indifference. Thomas stayed near Aloy, guiding him gently. "Stay where people can see you," he told the young man. "Not because you've done wrong, but because suspicion grows fastest in the shadows." Aloy nodded, grateful for the rare kindness. The search continued deep into the night. Lanterns bobbed in and out of sight between houses and trees. Doors opened, sheds were checked, tools moved aside. The villagers' breaths emerged in white clouds as they worked. After nearly an hour, one of the children, who had ignored the command to stay indoors, ran to the square shouting breathlessly. "I found something. Near the old granary." The villagers hurried to the spot, lantern flames flickering in the wind. Behind the granary, half hidden under a pile of branches, lay feathers, fresh, scattered, and stained with blood. Pierre crouched beside them, holding one up to the light. "These are from a chicken. And not old." Hugo, standing nearby, pointed at the ground. "Tracks small." They all bent closer. Not boot prints. Not Aloy's larger steps. But smaller prints, barefoot. Everyone looked at each other, confused. "Children?" someone asked. Mirelle shook her head. "No. These are too wide for a child. And look, see how the toes splay outward." Her voice dropped. "These belong to someone accustomed to walking without shoes." A hush fell. Pierre examined the prints carefully. "They lead toward the eastern woods." Renat muttered, "Poachers." But Mirelle glanced at him sharply. "No poacher risks coming this close. They steal from the forest, not from within a village." Thomas stepped forward. "Someone is hiding." The idea landed heavily. Hiding. Surviving. Stealing to stay alive. The crowd tensed. They followed the tracks cautiously, lanterns swaying. Aloy stayed toward the back, silently praying that whatever they found would clear his name. His hands were shaking. The tracks led them along a narrow path behind the granary, through thorny brush, and toward a cluster of fallen logs at the edge of the forest. Then Pierre stopped abruptly. "There?" he whispered. A faint rustling came from the hollow beneath the largest log. Hugo slowly lifted his lantern and lowered it to the opening. The light illuminated a pair of terrified eyes. Gasps rippled through the villagers. It wasn't a poacher, or a stranger, or a thief hiding food. It was a woman. She was filthy, shivering, wrapped in what looked like a torn cloak. Her hair hung in tangled mats. She clutched a small bundle of stolen bread, her chest rising and falling rapidly with fear. Mirelle stepped forward immediately, pushing aside the men. "Child," she said softly, kneeling. "Come out. No one will hurt you." But the woman shrank back, shaking her head violently. Pierre lowered his lantern, softening the light. "We will not harm you," he repeated gently. "We only want to understand." Slowly, painfully slowly, the woman crawled out from the hollow. She was younger than she first appeared, perhaps 25, but hunger and cold had carved deep shadows around her eyes. Mariette, Thomas's wife, gasped. Her feet, they're bleeding. Barefoot in the cold. Her skin cracked. Her toes swollen. She had walked who knew how far. Pierre wrapped his cloak around her shoulders. "What is your name?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Isabeau." "And why are you here, Isabeau?" he asked. Tears welled in her eyes. "I fled my village. There was sickness. Fever. Many died. My brother died." My mother died. I ran. I walked for days. No one would let me in. They said I carried death. The villagers exchanged uneasy looks. Fear crept behind their ribs. Disease was the great enemy of medieval life, silent, invisible, merciless. Isabeau continued, I was starving. I took only enough to live. Only what I needed. I meant no harm. Her voice cracked. And suddenly, everything shifted again. The villagers looked at Aloy, who had been moments away from accusation, and then back at Isabeau. They looked at the feathers, the missing grain, the scattered crumbs. They pieced together her story. She hadn't been stealing out of greed. She had been trying to survive. Morel moved first, taking Isabeau's trembling hands. You are safe now, she said softly. We will care for you. The villagers gathered around, the tension melting into empathy. But Renaud took one step back, fear tightening his voice. If she carries fever. Pierre cut him off sharply. Then we isolate her safely. Not condemn her. Hugo nodded. We learned from last winter. Morel added, and we will not repeat the harm we nearly caused. They brought Isabeau to the healer's hut near the stream, where Morel cleaned her feet, fed her broth, and covered her in blankets. Thomas and Mariette brought bread. Pierre brought warm water. Even Aloy came, leaving a quiet offering of dried fruit at the door. Renaud alone stood in the square, arms crossed, struggling between fear and the desire to maintain what little authority he had left. But something else was happening around him, something he hadn't fully recognized. The village had moved on without him. By morning, news of Isabeau spread. Children whispered about the barefoot woman. Elders debated the best way to keep her fed without risking exposure to illness. And through these discussions, a new kind of leadership emerged, not from wealth or force, but from compassion and shared responsibility. Over the next days, Isabeau regained strength. Her fever had long passed, she was no threat. She apologized repeatedly for stealing. The villagers told her the same thing again and again, you did what you had to do. And the village realized something important. Not all who take are thieves. Some are desperate. Some are fleeing danger. Some steal because starvation pushes harder than fear. Isabeau helped around the healer's hut. She chopped herbs, carried water, mended blankets. Children grew fond of her. Mariette taught her how to sew thicker winter garments. Pierre helped her build shoes. And soon, the villagers learned that the person they had nearly condemned wasn't Aloy. It wasn't Isabeau. It was their own unchecked fear. The ox incident had taught them one lesson. Isabeau's arrival taught them another. If justice is too quick, it becomes cruelty. If suspicion becomes a habit, it becomes tyranny. If fear governs a village, the village destroys itself. But St. Brian was no longer governed by fear. It was learning to be governed by conscience. Weeks turned into months. Autumn gave way to early winter. And something remarkable happened. Isabeau became part of the village. Not fully accepted at first, but steadily integrated. She found work helping Morel gather late-season herbs. She sang softly while tending the fire. She told stories of her mother, her brother, her lost home. Thomas, who saw himself reflected in her struggle, became something of an older brother to her. Mariette treated her like a younger sister. And Aloy, quiet, unsure, but kind, began spending more time near the healer's hut than his daily chores required. People noticed. They smiled. They whispered. But now the whispers were softer, kinder. Even Renaud softened over time. One cold morning, he delivered a sack of oats to Isabeau without saying a word. She thanked him gently. He cleared his throat and left without meeting her eyes. Still, it was a beginning. By the end of winter, Isabeau had regained full health. Her cheeks filled. Her eyes brightened. She wore boots that Pierre had helped her stitch and a cloak that Mariette had sewn from leftover wool. The villagers met under the old oak tree to discuss whether she should remain. Pierre spoke first. She has brought no harm. Only gratitude. Morel added, she has worked hard. And she carries no sickness. Hugo nodded. She deserves a home. The vote was nearly unanimous. And so Isabeau, once a starving fugitive hiding beneath a log, became a recognized member of St. Brian. Aloy smiled more in those days. Tomas felt a quiet pride. Mariette celebrated by baking honey bread. And even the elder remarked that the village had become wiser, more united, more resilient. St. Brian had come close to destroying itself. But instead, it transformed. Not by decree. Not by force. Not by law. But by learning to see the humanity in even the most fragile and frightened souls. A single accusation had nearly ruined them. A single runaway ox had nearly broken them. But a barefoot stranger had reminded them who they wanted to be. Winter settled over St. Brian like a gray wool blanket, thick, heavy, and unrelenting. Smoke curled from chimneys at dawn and lingered through the bleak afternoons. The world outside the village slowed to a near standstill as snow deepened and the forest grew silent. Inside, life continued with careful attention. The community had grown more watchful, not out of suspicion as before, but out of a new sense of collective responsibility. They were learning something rare for their era. Trust could be rebuilt if nurtured deliberately. Isabeau's presence became a quiet blessing during this time. She worked tirelessly, helping Mireille grind dried herbs, carrying buckets of water from the stream, preparing bundles of firewood with Aloy. Her soft singing could be heard in the square some mornings, a gentle brightness against the winter gloom. And the villagers, still mindful of their harsh lesson from the ox incident, treated her with a cautious but sincere warmth. They had learned that kindness was safer than fear, and that a village strengthened by compassion could weather storms far better than one poisoned by suspicion. But even a peaceful winter carries its own challenges. One evening, as the watchmen kept their post near the entrance of the village, they spotted movement near the tree line. At first Hugo thought it was wolves. Their shadows often danced at the edge of the woods. But the shape was different. Smaller. Moving strangely. He nudged Pierre. "Do you see that?" Pierre squinted. The figure moved slowly, hunched, dragging something behind. The torchlight flickered over white snow, and the silhouette paused, as if sensing the watchers. "Hold your ground," Pierre whispered. "Let's see who or what it is." The figure stepped forward again, struggling. And then something unexpected happened. It collapsed. Pierre and Hugo rushed across the snow, boots crunching loudly. They reached the fallen shape and gasped. It was an elderly man, frail, trembling, wrapped in tattered furs barely holding together. His beard was long and knotted, his hands raw from cold. And behind him was a small wooden sled carrying a bundle of poorly patched blankets and a sack of dried leaves. Pierre shook him gently. "Old father, can you hear me?" The man's lips moved, but no sound came out. His skin was icy to the touch. "Quick," Hugo said. "We must get him inside before he freezes." They lifted him carefully, supporting his weight between them, and carried him to the healer's hut. Mireille, startled by the sudden arrival, swung into action immediately. "Set him near the fire," she instructed. "Bring hot water. And prepare broth." Isabeau hurried to follow her instructions, her hands moving with practiced speed. Tomas and Mariette soon joined, offering blankets and tools as needed. When the old man finally opened his eyes, the firelight flickering across his face, the entire room fell silent, waiting. Mireille knelt beside him. "Rest, elder. You are safe. Tell us your name." The man swallowed weakly. "Odric. My name is Odric." "Where do you come from?" Pierre asked gently. Odric's eyes clouded. "From the valley beyond the ridge. My village, it is gone." A hush fell. "Gone?" Hugo repeated softly. "What do you mean gone?" Odric's hands trembled as he pulled the blanket tighter. "Winter fever. It swept through our homes. Many died. The young fled. I buried them until I could no longer stand. Then there was no one left to bury me." Isabeau covered her mouth with her hands, understanding all too well the pain of losing an entire home. Odric continued, his voice near breaking. "I wandered until I could wander no more. I thought I would die on the road. But your village, I saw the fire, and I prayed I could reach it." Pierre exchanged a heavy glance with Mireille. They had taken in a starving woman. Now fate had placed a dying elder at their doorstep. "Rest," Mirel said softly. You are home now. And with those words, something unspoken passed through the hut. St. Brian had become a refuge. Not by choice, not by proclamation, but by necessity and by the slow transformation brought on by hardship. Over the following days, Odric recovered strength in small increments. He ate little, slept often, and spoke rarely. But the villagers visited him, one by one, bringing firewood, blankets, small gifts, listening to his stories when his voice allowed. He told them about the winter fever that had taken his village. He described the silent streets, the unanswered prayers, the fear that turned neighbors into ghosts. And when Isabeau sat beside him, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You survived, he whispered. So few did. She lowered her eyes, tears forming. Odric's arrival reminded St. Brian of a harsh truth. Tragedies were unfolding everywhere. Suffering was close. Fear was nearby. And yet they had the power to choose how they responded. And they chose mercy. But mercy, like every virtue, invites its own test. One icy morning, as Pierre prepared to leave for the watch shift, he noticed a young villager, Mathis, speaking in hushed, tense tones to a group of men by the well. Pierre approached slowly, catching bits of the conversation. We cannot take in every wanderer. What happens when more arrive? When will it end? Today a woman. Yesterday an elder. Tomorrow, who knows? Another mouth to feed is another risk. Pierre stopped beside them. Is there a problem? Mathis hesitated, then stepped forward. We have limited food. Limited space. Winter grows harsher each year. If we become a refuge for everyone who suffers, we will eventually suffer ourselves. Some of the men nodded reluctantly. Pierre didn't react with anger. He understood the fear. It was the same fear that had driven Renaud months before. The same fear that could, if left unchecked, tear the village apart again. Mathis, Pierre said gently, do you believe we are worse off now than we were last winter? Mathis paused. No. But, Pierre continued, have we lost more than we gained by choosing compassion? Mathis opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer. Pierre put a hand on his shoulder. Fear is natural, but let it guide you and it will blind you. You saw what fear almost did to Tomas, to Eloy, to Isabeau. Are we to forget so quickly? Mathis lowered his eyes. I just worry about what comes next. As do we all, Pierre said. But a village survives not by shutting its doors. A village survives by strengthening its heart. The men slowly dispersed, thoughtful, uneasy, but more grounded. And Pierre realized something important that day. Leadership wasn't a title. It wasn't granted by wealth or age. It was earned through consistent choices. Choices that protected, that united, that elevated the collective above individual fear. As winter deepened, St. Brian faced another challenge, one they hadn't anticipated. A hunter returned injured from the forest edge, half frozen, rambling about strange noises and shadows moving between the trees. He insisted that wolves were gathering unusually close, far bolder than the year before. Hugo examined the tracks near the outskirts and confirmed the worst. A larger pack had moved into the area. The wolves weren't avoiding the village anymore. They were circling it. This sudden shift forced the villagers into action. The night watch doubled. Torches were set along the perimeter. Livestock were moved into reinforced enclosures. Men sharpened tools, prepared bows, practiced signals for danger. But something else happened too, something profound. Isabeau cooked warm meals for the watchmen. Odric shared techniques from his own village, tricks for deterring wolves with smoke and herbs. Mariette taught women how to secure windows and hide food. Eloy repaired tools and helped build barriers. Even Renaud, who had withdrawn into his own quiet shame, stepped forward and offered spare wood and rope. The village that had once been divided by fear was now united by necessity. And in their unity, something beautiful emerged. Communities in medieval Europe rarely had formal leaders. Lords lived far away. Churches lacked constant presence. Sheriffs were absent. Authority usually came from those who inspired confidence, not by mandate, but by the quiet force of presence. Saint Brian began to recognize theirs. Not Renat. Not the elder, though he still held respect. Not any single adult. But a group. Pierre, Hugo, Mirel, Tomas, Mariette, Isabeau, Aloy. Together, they formed a new kind of leadership, one built not on dominance, but on cooperation. Their voices guided the village through fear. Their decisions shaped responses. Their empathy kept suspicion from rising. And without realizing it, they had created a model of justice and survival rarely seen in isolated medieval communities. Night after night, the wolves prowled near the village, their howls echoing across the frozen fields. But each time, the watchmen lit torches, banged pots, shouted warnings, and drove the animals back. Not a single villager was harmed. Not a single animal lost. And through this hardship, the bond between them grew stronger. Odric recovered enough strength to walk again. Isabeau learned new skills. Aloy found a sense of belonging he had never known in any previous village. Tomas regained confidence. Mariette became a quiet pillar of support for all women in the village. Hugo grew into his role as protector. Pierre became the soul of reason. Even Renat softened, slowly, painfully, but genuinely. He began to ask for advice, something he would never have done a year earlier. The village stood firm. But the final test of their transformation came unexpectedly, one cold morning, as the snow melted just enough to expose the frozen earth beneath. A shout pierced the air. Tracks. Strange tracks. Near the southern field. The villagers gathered quickly. Pierre, Hugo, and several others followed the young shepherd who had spotted them. The prints were not wolf prints. Not human. Not deer or boar. They were large, deep, and unfamiliar, like something dragging weight behind it. The villagers stiffened. "What creature makes this?" someone whispered. Hugo knelt and examined the pattern. Not a predator. Something carrying. Pierre followed the tracks with his eyes. It came from the forest, and it went toward the abandoned shack. The villagers exchanged uneasy looks. The abandoned shack was the oldest structure near St. Brian, half-collapsed, leaning, once belonging to a hermit decades ago. No one lived there. No one used it. Children avoided it. It was little more than rotting wood and broken stones. But the tracks led directly to it. Pierre rose slowly. "We go together." And so they did. Lanterns. Tools. Torches. A calm sort of tension. As they approached the shack, a strange silence settled over the group. No wind. No birds. Only the crunch of boots on snow. Pierre lifted a hand. "Stay behind me." The door of the shack was slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently. And what they found inside would mark the next turning point in St. Brian's story, one that would push their unity, compassion, and courage to the absolute limit. The interior of the abandoned shack was dim, lit only by the faint glow of winter sunlight leaking through gaps in the broken walls. Dust floated in the air. The smell of rot and old wood clung to everything. Pierre stepped across the threshold first, Hugo close behind. The floorboards creaked under their weight. Outside, the villagers waited silently, breath visible in the cold. At first, the shack seemed empty, nothing but collapsed shelves, broken pottery, and a scattering of dried leaves blown in by the wind. Then they heard it, a faint, muffled sound. A sharp intake of breath. Rustling, click, panicked. Pierre raised his torch higher. And there, in the far corner of the shack, partially hidden behind an overturned table, lay a man curled in a tight ball. His face was gaunt, his clothes torn, his hair wild. He clutched a large sack wrapped in a stained cloth. His arms trembled as he pressed the sack protectively against his chest. Hugo stepped forward cautiously. "Sir? Can you hear me?" The man jerked backward, eyes wide with terror. Pierre held up a hand, palm open. "We are not here to harm you." But the man said nothing. He pressed himself even tighter against the wall, shaking violently. Pierre moved slowly, keeping his voice steady. "You're freezing. You need help. Come out and we'll bring you to warmth." The man finally spoke, in a voice raspy from thirst and fear. No, stay away." "We won't touch you," Pierre said. "Just tell us who you are." The man's eyes darted to the ground, then back to them. My name is Justin. Pierre exchanged a glance with Hugo. The name meant nothing to the villagers. Are you hurt, Justine? Hugo asked. Justine hesitated. No, not hurt. Just cold. Hungry. Pierre stepped closer. We can give you food, water, shelter. But Justine recoiled again. You don't understand. Hugo lowered his torch slightly. Then help us understand. Justine pressed the sack closer. His knuckles whitened. Then finally, with a voice cracking under fear, he whispered, It will kill you. The two men froze. Pierre's expression tightened. What will kill us? Justine swallowed. What I carry. I didn't want to bring it here. I tried to go around the village. But wolves chased me. I had to hide. What's in the sack? Hugo asked quietly. Justin's breathing grew erratic. Something dangerous. Something I meant to deliver far away. Something no one should ever touch. Pierre took a calm step forward. Show us. Justine shook his head violently. No. If I open it here, if I let you see. A crack of ice outside interrupted him. The villagers shifted anxiously near the door. Pierre turned back to Justine. We have faced danger before. Wolves, hunger, fear. Whatever is in that sack, we will handle it together. You don't need to hide. Justine looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for a reason to trust him. Then, with trembling hands, he unwrapped the cloth. Hugo leaned forward. Pierre leaned forward. The villagers behind them held their breath. Inside the sack, cushioned in straw and wrapped in linen, was a single wooden chest, small, carved with symbols neither of the men recognized. It looked ancient, foreign, unlike anything crafted in their valley. A chill swept through the shack. Justine whispered, Inside this box is a relic that belongs to a monastery 2 days from here. It was stolen from them by bandits. I took it back and fled before they killed me. They want this relic. Desperately. Pierre asked, What does it do? Justin's eyes filled with dread. I don't know everything. But the monks said it carries a sickness, an old sickness, sealed long ago. It is harmless sealed. But if the box is broken, if it opens, death spreads. Silence fell over the entire shack. Hugo gently set down his torch. How do you know the monks spoke truth? Justin's face twisted. Because they were dying. All of them. When I took it, I saw the bodies. The fever. The sores. They said it started when the box cracked slightly. They begged me to take it away and bring it to the high monastery where scholars could reseal it. Pierre rubbed his forehead. Why didn't you go directly there? I tried, Justine said. But wolves stalked me. And when I ran into the forest, I lost my sense of direction. Then snow came. Then hunger. Pierre stared at the chest for a long moment, then asked the question that worried every villager. Has the box cracked more? Justine shook his head. No. I keep it wrapped tight. The monks told me as long as the seal stays intact, no one is in danger. Pierre exhaled slowly. Hugo did too. Then Hugo said quietly, We cannot leave this here. Pierre nodded. We must move it. And Justine. He stepped out of the shack and called the villagers inside. When they entered, their faces twisted with fear at the sight of the strange chest. Mariette whispered, Is it cursed? The elders stepped forward. Pierre, what is this? Pierre explained everything carefully and calmly. He did not exaggerate. He did not soften the truth. And when he finished, silence fell like a heavy cloth. Renat stepped forward first, surprising everyone. We cannot allow something dangerous to remain in the village. Pierre agreed. Nor can we abandon this man. If bandits chase him, they could reach us. We must make a plan. The villagers gathered in a tight circle. Their breath mingled with the cold air. Fear was rising again, but this time it met resistance from reason, not panic. Mariette spoke softly. What do the monks want? The chest brought to a safer monastery? Justine nodded. Isabeau asked, How far is it? 2 days' travel, Justine replied. But I am too weak. And alone I will die. The elders stroked his beard. Then someone must guide you. Hugo stepped forward immediately. I will go, Pierre added, as will I. Renaud surprised them again. And me. People looked at him warily. But Renaud continued. I cannot change what happened before. But I can help now. After a long silence, Pierre nodded. Very well. Tomorrow at dawn, the three of us will escort Justine to the monastery. The villagers murmured anxiously, but no one objected. They secured the chest in thick cloth and leather bindings. Morel inspected Justine carefully, ensuring he bore no signs of illness. Thomas prepared warm cloaks and food for the travelers. Isabeau sewed an extra set of gloves for Justine. The next morning, the village gathered to watch the four men leave: Pierre, Hugo, Renaud, and Justine. The chest was strapped carefully to a sled. Torches burned against the early dawn. Before they departed, Pierre turned to the village and said, Fear nearly destroyed us once. Let caution guide us now, but not panic. Trust each other. Protect each other. And wait for our return. The villagers nodded. Some wept. Children clung to their parents. Isabeau whispered a prayer. And then the men disappeared into the white landscape, leaving Saint Brian behind. The journey was brutal. Snow deepened. Wind howled. Wolves stalked at a distance, glowing eyes in the darkness. But Pierre, Hugo, and even Renaud stood guard throughout the night, forming a circle around Justine and the chest. On the second day, they reached the high monastery, a massive stone structure perched on a mountain ridge, its bells silent in the cold. When they knocked, monks opened the gate with cautious relief. You brought it, one whispered. The monks led the travelers inside, where the chest was taken into a sealed chamber. Scholars examined the seal, nodding in quiet gratitude when they confirmed it was intact. You saved us, the head monk said. And you saved many others. This relic must be sealed away forever. Pierre asked, How dangerous is it? The monk replied, Dangerous enough to erase an entire village. You would not be the first. A chill ran through the men. They stayed one night at the monastery, then returned home, exhausted, but unharmed. When they re-entered Saint Brian days later, the villagers ran to meet them. Thomas embraced Pierre. Mariette hugged Hugo. Isabeau wept, seeing them safe. Renaud stood at the edge of the group, unsure how to accept the villagers' gratitude, but slowly, carefully, he began to find his place again. And so, the village survived another threat. Not because they panicked. Not because they accused blindly. But because they chose unity, reason, caution, and courage. And the lesson that echoed across Saint Brian was one that would guide them for generations. A village without a sheriff survives not by judgment, but by wisdom. The return of Pierre, Hugo, Renaud, and Justine marked a turning point in the village's slow evolution. The people of Saint Brian had endured a season of trials that would have shattered many other communities. False accusations, wandering strangers, sickness, wolves, hunger, and the arrival of a relic carrying the threat of death. But each time, instead of collapsing, they grew more resilient, more thoughtful, more united. And yet, peace in medieval life was never permanent. It was a fragile state, held together by labor, habit, and hope. The moment vigilance slipped, misfortune could reappear like a winter storm on a seemingly calm horizon. The months that followed were marked by rebuilding. Snow melted. The forests thawed. The soil softened under gentle spring rains. Saint Brian stirred back to life. Fields were plowed. Fences repaired. Livestock moved from winter barns to open pastures. Children played in muddy paths. Women washed clothes by the stream. Men mended roofs and carried timber. Thomas expanded his high-drying racks with the help of Hugo. Mariette planted a new herb garden with Isabeau at her side. Audric, though old and weary, insisted on helping by mending rope and teaching the children stories from his lost village. And Eloy, quiet Eloy, began lingering around Isabeau more openly. He carried heavy jars for her, helped her gather firewood, walked with her from the stream to the square. They were rarely seen apart. The village noticed. And for once, the whispers were gentle. Life seemed finally stable. But the soft harmony of Saint Brian was tested once more, this time by something entirely unexpected. One afternoon, a mounted rider appeared on the eastern road, galloping hard as if pursued. His cloak fluttered behind him, and the horse's hooves struck the ground with frantic urgency. Hugo, working at the edge of the field, was the first to spot him. "Rider approaching," he shouted. People paused their work. Children stopped playing. The rider slowed only when he reached the square, his horse frothing with sweat. He dismounted quickly, breathless, shaking snow and dirt from his cloak. "Is this Saint Brian?" he demanded. Pierre stepped forward, wary but calm. "It is." "Who are you?" "I am a messenger from the high monastery." The man's voice trembled, not from cold but from fear. "I bring urgent warning." The villagers exchanged alarmed glances. Pierre said, "Speak." The messenger swallowed hard. "The relic you returned, it was resealed. But the bandits who stole it in the first place, those who sought its power, escaped their pursuers. They were last tracked heading in this direction." A cold silence fell over the square. Hugo tensed. "How many?" "At least 6, the messenger replied. "Armed. Desperate. They know the monks lost the relic. They believe it may have passed through this valley." Renaud clenched his jaw. "They think we have it." The messenger nodded. "They will come searching. They may already be near." Fear rippled through the villagers. Mothers pulled their children close. Men exchanged grim looks. Old wounds from the winter reopened in their minds. Mariette whispered, "We cannot fight bandits." Audric leaned forward on his cane. "But we can defend ourselves." Pierre took a deep breath. "Messenger, how long do we have?" The man hesitated. "The monks believe the bandits may reach this valley within 2 days. 2 days. 2 days to prepare for armed criminals driven not by hunger or fear, but by greed and violence." Pierre turned to the villagers. "Listen carefully. We have survived wolves, sickness, cold, and our own mistakes. We will survive this too, if we act wisely." Fear threatened to rise, but this time, Pierre caught it before it could spread. He issued clear instructions. "Build barriers. Move livestock close to the village. Gather your weapons. Even farming tools can defend. No one travels alone. No one stays outside after dusk. And we must set watchers on every path." Hugo and Renaud stepped forward with him. "We will not be caught unprepared," Hugo added. "We stand together," Renaud said firmly. The villagers nodded. No accusations. No panic. Only readiness. For the first time in years, Saint Brian organized itself like a fortified settlement, not a simple village. Men sharpened scythes and axes. Women boiled water, prepared bandages, and stored food. Children gathered stones for defense. Even the elderly took positions at lookout points. Isabeau helped coordinate supplies with Mariette. Aloy reinforced weak sections of the livestock pens. Audric taught everyone how to listen for signs of approaching strangers, cracked twigs, rustling underbrush, changes in the bird songs. The transformation was astonishing. Where once Saint Brian had nearly torn itself apart over a lost ox, it now moved with unity and purpose stronger than any lord's command. That night, torches burned at the edge of the village. Watchers circled the perimeter every hour. Dogs barked at unfamiliar scents drifting from the forest. The sky was clouded, heavy with the promise of rain. At midnight, Pierre and Hugo stood watch near the southern path, where the trees formed a natural corridor. "Do you think they'll come?" Hugo asked quietly. Pierre nodded. "If they believe the relic passed through here, they won't stop until they search every hut." Hugo tightened his grip on his spear. "We have women, children. And we have each other," Pierre said firmly. "And the strength we didn't have last winter." Hugo let out a slow breath. "You think we can face armed bandits?" Pierre looked over the village, lanterns glowing softly in windows, shadows moving carefully behind walls, people sleeping under the protection of unity they had earned. He nodded. "I think we can face anything, if we remain as we are now." The next morning dawned gray, with low clouds hanging like heavy curtains. The village remained tense. No laughter. No idle conversation. Only preparation. By noon, The first sign appeared. Footprints. Fresh. Coming from the eastern woods. Pierre and Hugo followed them carefully. Renaud joined, bow in hand. The tracks led to a ridge overlooking the valley. Pierre knelt and placed a hand on the ground. 6 men, he said. Just as the messenger warned. Renaud scanned the trees. Where are they now? The answer came too quickly. A bird burst from the branches above them. Then another. Then a third. Something, or someone, was moving through the forest. Pierre motioned for silence. The 3 men crouched low. Moments later, voices drifted through the trees, rough, low, murmuring. Then the bandits appeared. 6 men, armed with daggers, clubs, and one with a rusted sword. Their clothes were worn, patched. Their faces were gaunt with hunger but hard with determination. They stopped at the ridge and looked down at St. Brian. One of them pointed. The village. That's where he would have gone. Another spat. They must know something. We'll search every house if we must. Pierre's heart pounded. Hugo's grip tightened. Renaud stared with cold intensity. The bandits began moving down the slope. Pierre whispered, "Warn the village." Hugo nodded and sprinted back quietly. Renaud hesitated only a moment, then followed Hugo. Pierre remained alone, hidden behind a fallen log, watching the bandits advance. He knew he couldn't stop them. He knew he couldn't confront them. But he could slow them down. He picked up a rock and tossed it deep into the underbrush opposite the bandits. The sound cracked loudly, branches snapping, leaves scattering.